The Tom Woods Show, episode 631.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, it's a presidential election year, which is as good a time as any to say down with presidential idolatry. Learn the real history of the U.S. presidents and their crimes against liberty with our free course over at freehistorycourse.com. You'll get videos, audio files, a complete PDF bibliography, a whole bunch of goodies, all for nothing. So check it out at freehistorycourse.com. Hi everybody, Tom Woods here, talking about the intersection of economics and the virtues today with two guests who, in fact, are editors of a brand new volume just out from Oxford University Press called Economics and the Virtues, Building a New Moral Foundation. And we're joined today by Jennifer Baker and Mark White. Jennifer Baker is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the College of Charleston, and Mark White is a professor and chairman of the Department of Philosophy at the College of Staten Island of the City University of New York. I will be linking to their book at tomwoods.com/631. Jennifer and Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tom.
It's very rare, not absolutely unheard of, but very rare that I have two guests on simultaneously. But why not, right? I mean, you're both the brains behind this project, so let's talk to both of you. Let's talk about. I have a really specific question, and I'm going to jot it down actually to make sure I get it answered later about this question of ethics and economics. But first, before I start asking you some things about this topic, tell me what you want the reader to get after going through this collection. What gap are you filling with this book?
Great. Well, we were excited about the idea of trying to bridge the distance between people who work in philosophy on virtue and economists. So we're trying to ask virtue ethicists to think harder about economics and economists to think harder about virtue.
Are you able to tell people what virtue ethics is?
Yeah, I can. We tried there.
Yeah, it was a rhetorical question.
Oh, wait, was it really?
I knew you could do it, but I would like you to.
Well, virtue ethics comes out of the ancient Greek philosophical tradition. So most of the ancient Greeks were virtue ethicists. Sometimes it's called eudaimonism, but Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, the Epicureans, they were all virtue ethicists. And then philosophy continued on, very influenced by their thoughts on many things, including right and wrong. But at the start of the 20th century, we didn't have active accounts of virtue ethics. So after a call from a top philosopher in the middle of the 20th century to return to the ancient Greek thought about ethics, many philosophers did so. So now we have modernized accounts. Some of them are so modernized that you won't get any ancient Greek lines in them. But now we have modernized accounts. Some do often refer back to the ancient Greeks that have updated this account of how morality can be determined through a consideration of a standard human psychology. So a good person is a real tool in a virtue ethics approach. They believe there is such a thing, that we can become better or worse, that we have a role to play in that type of development. And what is good for a human to do is what is possible for a good person to do. Is that okay for a start?
That's an excellent answer. Now, these days, I do want to talk a little bit about the idea of economics being value-free and see how that fits into this. But even as recently as Adam Smith, I mean, we have this modern idea, this idea that as we get closer to the 21st century, we see economics shedding some of its let's say, moral or moralizing baggage. But yet as recently as the 18th century and with Adam Smith, I'm pretty sure his title or his department involved moral philosophy.
Right, absolutely.
So what does that mean? What does it mean that Adam Smith was not just descriptively teaching how the market works? What else was he teaching?
Well, he had a huge ethical theory, so he's a virtue ethicist of a sort, too. And it used to be called the Adam Smith problem, where people were perplexed as to how he could do ethics and write on economics, which is pretty pretty funny from our perspective because we see the two as so easy to relate. But we actually have a chapter in our book by Eric Schlieser that really carefully documents the trends in economics and why and how economists began to think that they couldn't comment or include ethical thought in their work.
This, to me, is the most interesting question of all, because frankly, I have been persuaded by the Misesian view that economics simply describes cause and effect relationships. So if I've got prices at a certain level and the money supply increases, the prices are going to be higher than they would have been otherwise. Or if I have a milk subsidy, or if I have price controls on milk, there are going to be these consequences. Whether you think that's a good or a bad thing is an interesting question, but surely the economist has his hands full enough with the question of figuring out how it all works. I mean, likewise, a physicist can tell you what's going to happen with a projectile, but we don't look to the physicist to tell us whether I should throw a baseball at that old lady. I don't look to the physicist for that. Why should I want to look to an economist for moral insight?
Yeah, that's wonderful. Or the question might be, why would an economist have to worry about morality? That comes up in your description too. And one chapter we have by Michael Barman and Jeffrey Brennan is a wonderful philosopher and an economist who's written for a long time. They look at the practical relevance of virtue and its account of moral psychology to the work that economists already do. So they think it's real important in explaining phenomenon that economists can measure, and they think it's even interesting as a category that should be studied in terms of something that's produced. So virtuous people act in particular ways, and they want to be able to measure and integrate that. So they have this wonderful chapter laying out all the challenges and all the fits of a virtue economics perspective if added into mainstream economics today. It's pretty neat.
Can you describe for me what that might look like? I mean, in other words, I've read, now I can't think of his name. Oh, doggone it, I can't think of his name, but I'll think of it while we're talking. But I have seen people who have written books and articles saying that there's something wrong, there's something left out of neoclassical economics. And what's left out of it is it sucks all the life out of human existence, that everything is reduced to things that can be quantified and can be expressed mathematically. And I can agree with that. I definitely agree with that. But from the point of view of two people who just put together a volume on bringing ethics back into economics, tell me, what would economics look like? If I'm in Economics 101, how would it be different if the two of you had your way as opposed to how it's being taught now?
Oh, that's a good one. Mark, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll take that one. The two ways really, I'm thinking back to the question you asked last, and they really tie in because you implicitly referenced the positive side of economics, the more descriptive side of economics. What happens when this price goes up? What happens when incomes fall? And also the sort of more controversial policy side of economics, where economists make recommendations for policy which naturally hinges on politics and ethics. And I think if you incorporated ethics explicitly into an Eco 101 course, it would affect both sides of that. For instance, when you have the predictive side, what will happen when a price falls, the standard answer is based on pure self-interest. And one of the results you get when you merge ethics and economics is you consider that individuals are not always motivated solely by self-interest. Now, this may not always affect just normal reactions to price changes, but it could affect purchases that are, say, ethically motivated. People that want to buy fair trade coffee, their reaction to a price increase may be less than to normal coffee, etc. So you have a more elaborate model of human behavior that incorporates ethics other than pure self-interest utilitarian impulses. And then on the policy side, which is basically just welfare economics, which again is utilitarianism under a different term, you can incorporate other aspects of policy decision-making, such as rights, such as duties, such as virtues, and come up with a much wider range of policy options and a much richer way to choose between them.
Well, let me ask you this. Why would I have a model like that, or how would that help me? I mean, in the sense that, suppose we have a case where a lot of people are very, very attached sentimentally to a particular town. And because they have an attachment to that town and they're very, very unlikely to move, well, maybe they're willing to accept they would tolerate lower wages than they otherwise would because they are getting another type of income. They're getting a psychic income, the enjoyment they get from living in a town that gives them, this sentimental value. Now, to me as an economist, if I were an economist, I would just say the attachment that they feel toward the town is just one of the factors that goes into making up the labor supply schedule. It doesn't really matter to me what their motivation is. If they're willing to accept this wage, then they're willing to accept this wage. I don't really have to know what's going through their heads or whether, from my point of view, they're being strictly speaking rational or not. All I need to look at is the actual decisions they make. So, why do I need to psychologize and get into their heads and figure out what their motivations are? It doesn't affect the analysis.
But it may affect your predictions of future behavior if you don't know exactly why they're acting as they're acting now.
Well, that's true. I mean, certainly on a micro level as a firm, I would want to know. I would be interested to know what motivates them, what makes them take one job over another, what makes them want to stay in one area over another. But I mean, I guess I'm very, very much in the Misesian paradigm on this, and it's partly because I think it's that I myself was on the receiving end of quite a bit of vitriol over the years from people who are Catholic traditionalists, and their view was that I was putting forth this awful Enlightenment point of view, which they just rejected out of hand because it comes from the Enlightenment. So their view was that if you want to move away from making moral statements in economics, then this is a project of the devil, basically. That there's no other motivation for that. But again, my view was that I don't look to a chemist to tell me if I should commit suicide by drug overdose or not. I look to the chemist to tell me which drugs do I use for which purpose. But I don't expect him to be rendering moral judgments.
Right.
But you expect him to understand why the drug works the way it does.
Yeah. I see. Okay.
And we're finding economists finding that they need ethical theory, which to me is such a compliment to philosophy. You know, as a philosopher, I always get a little nervous that we aren't practical. But when we see experimental economists going back and reading Hume and Kant and Smith in order to understand their results, Amartya Sen talked about the role of commitment in people's decision making. And so one of our authors, Jeffrey Brennan, really argued what you just have. You know, we don't need to know if people are committed to certain preferences or not. We just need to know they have certain preferences. But it actually did turn out to be helpful in modeling to know if there were commitments or not. So that's nice. Another option is that we don't change economics, but we supplement it with an understanding of ethics. And this would just kind of clarify how people think. So we have a lot of options in this book. It's not one proposal. And you gave me a little ad for my chapter because I suggest we leave economics as it is, but that we recognize it's the study of non-moral things. Does that sound?
Yeah, I think that's exactly my view. And that I think you're looking in the wrong place. Like, I'm a libertarian, and so sometimes people will say, life is about more than liberty. And I say to them, I'm not looking to answer all the questions you have about the meaning of your existence. I'm just trying to say, what's the best way for us to live in peace? And then you go figure that stuff out.
Right.
And likewise, if you're looking to capitalism or some economic system to give you meaning, I think you're looking in the wrong place. That's only one piece of the puzzle. And I do think it is, at some level, it's unavoidable that you have to even implicitly deal with ethics, because you could still say that you're being value free. But if your entire framework takes for granted the existence of private property,
right,
and a price system and so on,
right,
well, that is a kind of ethical assumption.
Exactly.
Right. It's already there.
All right. Can I ask you guys a question about your own personal views on – because I haven't – just to make this more fun for me, I did not look into your backgrounds. So just for fun. So
Thank
I just
God.
want to know, what are your own – and you don't have to tailor this to my audience. They're wonderful, open-minded, tolerant people.
Of course they are.
But if you could – you're darn right. So if you if you had your way, what economic system do the two of you prefer? Do you give the same answer?
Are we pro-market? Is that?
That's kind of what I'm driving at.
Yeah, I mean, I very much am, Mark.
Yes, me too.
Okay. All right. Good. All right. So let me ask you guys a question that has frankly bothered me for quite a while, and I haven't admitted this. Sometimes when I have an issue or I don't get something, I'm too closed off. I don't open myself to my listeners and say, I'm struggling with this question. So now I'm going to be open with you guys and tell you about this problem. Let's imagine we've got a typical, let's say, store owner, and he has dreams of outcompeting all the other store owners.
Okay.
Now there are ways of looking at what he's doing. On the one hand, what he's really fundamentally dreaming of is, I want to provide more value to customers than anybody else is providing. Now, if you think of it in that way, that's entirely admirable and respectable, and we can all be on board for that.
Right.
But if he's thinking to himself, I want all these other people to suffer, and I want them all to go out of business and lose their jobs and be miserable so that I can be the big dog in town.
Right.
Well, the practical things that he does are no different, but his interior disposition about it is quite different.
Right.
And could we say, what do we say about that? What do we say about that?
Well, that's what we're on about. So that's one way we're helpful. So, we're trying to get academics to work together, but we're also addressing practical confusions that people have when they think about these things. So I love your example. It comes up in my chapter. I worry that when we only think economic norms are rational, we can't even explain our own behavior. So if we only think we can, attempt to profit from every sale that in the toy store we own, we will think we're not free to give a toy away to the poor kid who's there without a parent. But we do have that freedom. Right? So virtue ethics reminds you that you can do very expensive ethical things and that you have those choices all the time. And when we talk as if there isn't always a costly option or an option to perform business as usual in a way where we understand it as ethical because long term it seems to benefit the majority, right? That's what I try and contribute in my chapter is a complement to business as usual. So there's nothing unethical about only selling the toys in your store and, paying attention to the bottom line and that type of thing. But it's ethical because it's long-term contributive to general welfare. So they're both ethical things you're doing, but you have these choices in there.
Mark, do you want to jump in on this?
Well, it just reminds me, I've written a bit on antitrust, and I'm very critical of antitrust law and antitrust enforcement. And I always get a kick out of whenever a company is persecuted under the antitrust laws, and they drag out some interior emails with the CEO. I think Bill Gates did it when Microsoft was being investigated, and they found emails where Bill Gates was telling his VPs that he wanted them to slaughter another company, or he wanted them to leave another company in the dust, and that was taken as evidence that they're doing something wrong.
Right.
And I could never understand this because if we listen to the locker rooms in a football game,
I was just going to say
they're going to jump out there, and we're going to hopefully have a good time with these guys, and we're going to respect them as opponents, and we're going to we hope we all have fun, and if we win, great. If they win, great. It's not like that. If we think of this as competition, and these are human beings in competition, they're naturally going to get antagonistic toward each other. As long as they're not doing anything illegal or fraudulent or murderous, literally, then I don't see why a little gamesmanship on each party's side is a problem. And but that's taken, they're held to such a high standard that their, interior mindset has to be virtuous, or else they're doing something wrong. And I think that completely misunderstands the nature of business competition. If we want to be truly competitive, competition involves those sort of antagonistic sentiments as long as they don't bleed over into actual illegal activity.
All right, I think that probably also hits another example I had in mind, but let's think of an individual who's not a business, just an individual, and there's some kind of natural disaster, and people need, the supplies of a lot of necessary goods has diminished. And I could imagine a person who, for whatever reason, has a huge stockpile of, let's say it's bottled water. And now, of course, we know that in those circumstances, when supply is unexpectedly and very, very suddenly diminished, and the demand is very great, that of course prices will tend to go up, and what that does, that has a good effect, as you both know, is that it makes people conserve these scarce resources. If the price stayed the same, we'd all waste the water, we'd dump it over our heads or something, but we drink it and we make sure that we get the most out of it. Okay, but suppose the person who has all this water, it wants to sell it at $10 a bottle, not because he's thinking, well, this will be a good way to conserve the water so that people won't use excessive amounts. He's just thinking, I am going to exploit this situation to take advantage of suffering people. Because that's the way anti-market people look at this. They say, I don't care that your model tells us that this gives us efficiency. The fact is, he has a terrible interior disposition, and the system rewards that.
Right. And one thing we can do is separate out economics from virtue to point out that in economics, a non-virtuous person can actually do a lot of good. It's just not the same kind of good as virtue good, right? We just need different categories, but they can really benefit general welfare just through their competitiveness or even through their vice. That is possible too. So that's one suggestion we have in the book.
Right. We're bringing ethics and economics back together, but we're not merging them, so you can still distinguish between them. You can say that what this person is doing has ultimately positive economic effects, even though we would not describe this person, him or herself, as necessarily virtuous.
Right.
How do the people in this volume, tell me something of the scope of agreement and disagreement among them?
There's it's like an array of options. So we force them to talk about the same kind of virtue, I think, right, Mark? I mean, so one frustrating thing about anthologies can be if they aren't all talking about the same thing. So I think our authors are all talking about the same accounts of virtue and relating them to each other. It's a common account of virtue that they're sharing, but it really is an array of options. So there are some authors that suggest that markets have gotten a bad rap and they encourage pro-social behavior, right? They encourage good behavior. Then there are other authors that are suggesting that what we need to look forward to is a way to incorporate virtue into traditional economic modeling. The first part of our book is a historical look at what economics was originally. It was originally a moral science. So it's a good way of distinguishing Aristotle's influence, his actual influence, and what people might think it is or hope it would be today. And so it's a range of options. Historical, forward-looking.
Now, this is no doubt covered in Jason Brennan's chapter, and as I told you before we went on, I've had him as a guest on the show, his chapter on Do Markets Corrupt?
Yeah.
This, of course, provokes a question that you would be likely to get from hostile readers, which would be, how can you even think in terms of the virtues and the market economy in the same sentence?
Yeah. I mean, I'd put the burden on them to tell us what virtue was, right? I mean, often that work isn't done. Critics of the market can be very casual because they're just kind of pointing out non-ideal situations or that bad behavior is compatible with the market. So we've got we kind of begin with all of that, but just being careful and rigorous about what you mean to call morality is pretty helpful in those debates.
And I would think also the question of what is your alternative? And I don't want to make it sound like the market economy is so bad that we're just reduced to saying, well, it's the best of all the terrible options. I don't think that at all. But honestly, if they're going to say that greed is rewarded by capitalism, what system doesn't reward greed?
Right, yeah, right.
Exactly.
It's just which greedy people get rewarded and how do they get rewarded and what
Right.
are the rewards?
Right. We agree.
All right, tell me something. Let's see. Every one of these. I could do an episode, and maybe I will.
They're very
Happy to
good.
do that.
They're all very good.
Yeah. I mean, I'm looking. Yeah, every single one of these would make for for a good episode. So where'd this idea come from? Is this one of these things where the publisher comes to you and says, here's a great idea, now you go out and find the authors? Or did you hold a conference? How does this come about?
It started with, we had a conference session at the annual National Economics Conference in January that was hosted by the International Network for Economic Method, kind of one of the more philosophically oriented economics organizations. And it was on economics and virtue, and we had 3 or 4 panelists and gave a wonderful array of papers. And I just got the idea to approach Oxford University Press, whom I'd worked with before on book projects, and pitched this idea to them about an anthology on economics and virtue. And they were understandably skeptical at the beginning, but my masterful skills of salesmanship won them over. And it was a long process. I mean, they're a very careful press, a very reputable press for a good reason. And they made us hone the proposal and shape the proposal, and they got a tremendous amount of commentary on it. And eventually we got it in a shape that they liked, and we got an assortment of people that impressed them. And then the fun began.
Is there a consensus among the contributors to this volume? And by the way, if not, then is there at least a consensus among the two of you as to where you feel economics got off track?
Off track.
Such that you would need a volume like this to try to put things back together.
Oh, okay. Well, I think, most of academia can probably be accused of insufficient interdisciplinarity. That I guess is just a result of our specialization and the way we get tenure, that type of thing. Do you agree, Mark? So I'm not even sure that's so unusual. A good economist is going to be working on economics all the time. It's one of the things we were excited about. Once in a while there'll be an article in a business ethics journal that will suggest that because markets are so helpful to us, people who do well in markets must be ethical. I think that's kind of naive. One example I have is I spoke at a business ethics conference to a bunch of business leaders once, and they were nodding along as I was talking. Virtue ethics is kind of inspiring. But then they nudged each other at lunch to tell me something. I'm like, what? And they said, we were nodding along, but the advice we actually agree upon? When your competition's drowning in the swimming pool, shove the hose in their throat. Laughs on me. I mean, that's the kind of thing that, it's insufficient interdisciplinarity that has us have one clear voice that can address that type of confusion. But that's the kind of thing we're after. We're trying to explain how all these things fit together. And we actually need experts in different disciplines to do that if it's going to be adequate at all.
Right. Now, I don't want to say his name because I'm afraid people will take this out of context. He said it in jest, but I had a big time CEO on the show, and he said, if you don't kick a man when he's down, when are you going to kick him?
Yeah, okay, that's great. That's my new favorite.
Fine. So, but it seems to me that if you were speaking to a group of business people, surely some of them deep down must be annoyed at the way the culture portrays them. They are the worst villains around. We have all kinds of horrifying people in the government and the bureaucracy, but yet always the villain is in business, and it's presumed that what they're doing is not valuable, or they're exploiting people, or they're exploiting resources. That, I don't care how much money you have, that has to wear on you after a while, and it would be nice to hear it told that you actually are doing something that's noble and that is respected by society.
Oh, I think so. And we have an example of, I guess it's in my chapter. Sorry, Mark, I keep talking about my chapter, not yours. But we have how'd that happen?
Good chapter.
We have an example of a person who was working at a call center who got interviewed by CNN, I believe, and he was working for a debt collection agency. And you can't imagine more negative things that you could say about yourself. He was just saying, I would intimidate people, I would scare them, I would lie, I'm so ashamed of the work I did. And the point I make is that, debt collectors are really helpful because that's how we get loans, is the assurance.
No one would lend if they didn't think they could collect.
Right. Yeah. But it's just everyday people who are struggling to understand the good in even those low. I tend to think CEOs do get a lot of compliments. They meet the employees that are grateful for them. But I think even at the lower levels, there's a lot of philosophical confusion about what we're contributing when we are participating in the market.
And I should point out, by the way, there's nothing unique to the market about that. I think of the example of a guy I know. I'm actually godfather to one of his kids, and he's a former Marine recruiter. And he told me things that, I mean, he must have just needed to get it off his chest. I was surprised he told me. He said, I used to lie like you wouldn't believe to intimidate these young kids because they would come to me and say, I've had second thoughts and I think I don't want to do it. And I would tell them, it doesn't matter if you've had second thoughts. You'll get in big trouble if you don't go. And now that you've consented to it, and of course they can change their minds. There's no law against that. But I would scare them into agreeing to their original commitment. So, I mean, it's not like there's going to be an economic system that will either stop people from lying or keep us from doing undesirable things. You're expecting too much from an economic system.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And that also is supportive of how important we think philosophy on morality is. I mean, it'd be wonderful if morality were easy for us to each individually understand, but we just run into puzzles that we face in life all the time. That guy could have been really helped out by reading Kant or the ancient Greeks. They address those sorts of questions that people have about their own behavior.
Well, the book is Economics and the Virtues, Building a New Moral Foundation. I'm going to link to it at tomwoods.com/631, which is the episode number for today. Is there anything you guys would like to either A, say in conclusion, and or B, plug like another book or a website or anything else? The floor is yours.
Go for it, Mark.
I hope this. I mean, this is what I do. I've written or edited a number of books in economics and ethics, and I hope that each one is going to generate, conversations. Even if people disagree with the book or disagree with various chapters in the book, of course not Jennifer's because it's perfect. But if I just hope it starts conversations and starts people talking about it, because we're not trying to settle any issue about economics and ethics. We're trying to get people talking about it more, and that's really the most I hope for.
Yeah. Anyone who reads this book will be caught up with academic work on the subject. They'll feel very confident. Okay,
well, that's a pretty good claim to make for it. Very good. Okay, so linking to it on the show notes page, which I will repeat before I let people go today. And thanks to both of you, Jennifer and Mark, for your time today.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so
Tom.
much.
It was great.
It's so nice.
All right, before I let you folks go, I want to tell you about a really interesting new site that was just started by a Tom Woods Show listener, and it's called empoweredmen.com. And the way the creator of the site describes it to me in email is, it's a self-improvement site for young men. So far, I have covered content ranging from how to be more comfortable with being alone to how to roast your own coffee. My goal is to create libertarians out of my readers by encouraging them to become more independent as individuals. And then on the site itself, he says, we will talk about relationships, health, intellectual pursuits, careers, and other topics. So very much worth checking out at empoweredmen.com. And remember, if you go ahead and get your hosting through my link, then I will give you a shout out for your new blog or website. Plus, I'll give you a bunch of tutorials that will cut down the learning curve tremendously for you so you can be up and running as a skilled blogger in no time at all. If that package appeals to you, then get the details at tomwoods.com/publicity. We've got a really juicy episode of Contra Krugman coming out this weekend, so if you haven't checked that out yet, then make sure and check that out, indeed, at contrakrugman.com. Thanks for listening. See you next week.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.